Thanks for joining us on this cloudy day. Hey, I just want to, I'm going to do something a little different this morning. We're going to jump right into the message, and we will do prayer afterwards in response. So it'll make a little more sense after the sermon while we're doing it that way. But, so if you have your Bibles, go ahead and grab them. We're going to get right to work this morning. The passage comes from the book of Genesis chapter 18. So let's start by reading it together. Genesis chapter 18, we're going to read verses 10 through 15. The Lord said, I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah your wife shall have a son. And Sarah was listening at the tent door behind him. Now Abraham and Sarah were old, advanced in years, and the way of women had ceased to be with Sarah. So Sarah laughed to herself, saying, After I am worn out and my Lord is old, shall I have pleasure? And the Lord said to Abraham, Why did Sarah laugh and say, Shall I indeed bear a child now that I am old? Is anything too hard for the Lord? At the appointed time, I will return to you about this time next year, and Sarah shall have a son. And Sarah denied it, saying, I did not laugh, for she was afraid. But God said, No, you did laugh. Well, are you guys ready this morning for another Lewis and Clark story? Sorry, I don't have one this morning. Too bad. Instead, I'm going to go back, instead of going 200 years back to Lewis and Clark, I'm going to go back actually this past Monday, something that happened 41 years ago. The miracle on ice. Perhaps you know the story. Maybe you watched it on TV. At the height of the Cold War, the Soviet Union's hockey team had been completely dominating the Olympics. The team hadn't lost a game in the Olympics since 1968, 12 years straight. And so when the United States faced them in the medal round of the 1980 Olympics, it seemed that the Soviet dominance would only continue. Because not only were Soviets an incredible professional team, they had incredible professional hockey players on their team, but the U.S. hockey players were amateurs and mostly unknown college kids. On paper, the competition wasn't going to be even close. And so how it ended was a shock to the entire world. Oh.
That has some noise.
Yeah. USA. But I love what Al Michaels, the announcer, says. Do you believe in miracles? Yes! Right? Just that enthusiasm. Do you believe in miracles? Well, as we've been chronicling through the story of Abraham, if I can get through here, we've been looking at our series called Into the Unknown, which is all about walking with God in uncertain times. And as we've been looking at the life of Abraham, it's all so far centered around the promise of a miracle. That one day, Abraham's barren wife, Sarah, will give birth to a son. And from this son will come a great nation. As we've seen again and again, Abraham is holding on to this promise. He's been reassured of his promise. And we've even seen him and his wife Sarah doubt whether miracles are even possible. So much so that in chapter 16, they took matters into their own hands with Abraham when Abraham slept with Sarah's slave, Hagar, who then in turn bore him a son, Ishmael. And as we pointed out last week, after all that craziness happens, 13 years go by. God doesn't say much at all. God is relatively silent. But at the age of 99, God appears to Abraham yet again, and both expands his covenant promise to him by declaring his commitment not just to Abraham, but to the coming generations of Abraham's family, but also by calling upon Abraham and his family to embrace this covenant through the act of circumcision. And included in that is a very clear promise that indeed Sarah will have a son. She'll have a son in the coming year, and his name is to be Isaac. And now we get to chapter 18. We are going to see a transition in the story. But we're also going to get a unique look at who this God is that Abraham is considering. Who this God is that's making this promise to him. And in our passage today, we're going to see 3 questions that cue us into the characteristics of our God. And so let's begin by looking at our passage together. Genesis chapter 18. We're going to read the first 8 verses. And the Lord appeared to Abraham by the oaks of Mamre as he sat at the door of his tent in the heat of the day. He lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, 3 men were standing in front of him. When he saw them, he ran from the tent door to meet them, and bowed himself to the earth, and said, O Lord, if I have found favor in your sight, do not pass by your servant. Let a little water be brought, and wash your feet, and rest yourselves under the tree, while I bring a morsel of bread, that you may refresh yourselves, and after that you may pass on, since you have come to your servant. So they said, do as you have said. I'll try not to move too much. And Abraham went quickly into the tent to Sarah and said, Quick! 3 seahs of fine flour, knead it and make cakes. And Abraham ran into the herd and took a calf, tender and good, and gave it to a young man who prepared it quickly. Then he took curds and milk and the calf that he had prepared, and set it before them. And as he stood by them under the tree, while he ate. Dave, could you get me the handheld maybe? That might be a little less static. Thank you, sir. Yeah, I figured you don't want us to screeching all night. But so this is Abraham's situation. He gets an unexpected guest. Have you ever had an unexpected guest? Someone who showed up at your door unannounced? Like I feel like back in the day, that was a lot more common, right? Back in the day, people would kind of just show up unannounced. They come in, you'd make them something to eat, it's just a little more part of the culture. But nowadays, it's almost weird if someone knocks at your door. Especially some of you who live out in the sticks, right? If someone comes knocking at your door, what's going on here? Who's that? And if it's nighttime, it could be a little scary. But, I think a part of it is that nowadays, people, I don't know about you, but like me, I kind of just hang around at home in my pajamas, right? When I'm at home, I'm in my sweatpants, I'm wearing my Walmart sweatshirt, I'm not looking fancy, I'm looking like a hobo, that's just how I hang out at home, right? And that's just how it is, at least in my home, I feel like a lot of our homes. But so when someone comes to the door, it's almost like you got to run and hide, right? Don't look at me, I'm in my pajamas, But I want you to imagine that you're at home, you're in your pajamas, your hair's a mess, your house is a disaster, and you only have leftovers in the fridge, and all of a sudden you get a knock on your door, and there, standing in front of you, is Governor Reynolds, President Biden, and President Trump. Talk about being caught off guard, right? Incredibly important people standing at your door, and you are a mess. Well, this is exactly what we see happen to Abraham. He gets some unexpected guests, that completely catch him off guard. And these guests are extremely important. We're told in verse 1 that it is God himself who appears to Abraham. And we learn in chapter 19 that the two other men are angels. God and two of his angels are appearing to Abraham in human form. You know, a couple weeks ago we spent a considerable amount of time talking about the significance of God appearing in this way. Specifically, that it is what we call a Christophany, right? It's an appearance of a pre-incarnate Jesus. And if you missed that discussion, I encourage you to look back a couple weeks ago on YouTube or whatever. We have some videos of that sermon. But here is God in front of Abraham, coming to him in human form. And you know, it's hard to say if Abraham fully knows who it is that's in front of him, right? He calls him Lord in verse 3, but it's, the connotation there is a polite way of saying like sir, right? Which would be appropriate for a strange guest, but calling God that might seem a little more of an understatement, I guess. But regardless of his understanding of the true identity of his guests, he treats them as if they are important. He extends a hand of hospitality to these strangers, which they accept. And what happens next, I find to be kind of humorous, right? He begins to run around his camp kind of like a chicken with his head cut off, right? He's running around trying to get things ready, right? We're told that he quickly goes to Sarah and he says, Sarah, quick, make cakes. And then we're told he runs to grab a calf. And then he gives it to a servant who prepares it quickly, right? There's an emphasis on the rush here. He's running, he's going quickly. And all of this is happening in the heat of the day. So this is a 100-year-old man, okay? He's a sweaty, hard-breathing mess after all this is done. But finally, he quickly prepares this meal and he gives these guests a hearty Wisconsin meal, right? Cheese curds, milk, and steak. I think you guys know what you're going to have for lunch this afternoon now. So cheese curds and steak sounds great. So Abraham quickly makes these strangers feel at home, but now he learns why they're actually there. So let's look at it now. Look at verse 9 in your Bibles. And they said to him, "Where is Sarah, your wife?" And he said, "She's in the tent." The Lord said, "I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah, your wife, shall have a son." And Sarah was listening at the tent door behind him. Now Abraham and Sarah were old, advanced in years. The way of women had ceased to be with Sarah. So Sarah laughed to herself, saying, "After I am worn out, and my Lord is old, shall I have pleasure?" And the Lord said to Abraham, "Why did Sarah laugh and say, 'Shall I indeed bear a child now that I am old?' Is anything too hard for the Lord? At the appointed time I will return to you about this time next year, and Sarah shall have a son." But Sarah denied it, saying, "I did not laugh," for she was afraid. And he said, "No, but you did laugh." So in chapter 17, God made a declaration to Abraham concerning Sarah's participation in the promise. And now he's making that declaration again, except this time, Sarah hears it for herself. And so the picture we have here is that the men are gathered around the food at the center of the camp, with Sarah in a tent nearby. Given the customs of the day, it wasn't appropriate for women to join into the conversation with the men. And so Sarah would have been hanging out in the tent, kind of eavesdropping on what they're talking about, rather than being in the center with the guys. But she was close, and again, she was close enough to hear what was being said. She was definitely within earshot. And so when they ask where Sarah is, Abraham tells them, like, "Hey, she can hear you. She's right by you in the tent." And presumably the pre-incarnate Jesus kind of clears his throat and speaks a little louder and says, "Sarah is going to have a son," and declares it loud enough for her to hear. And behind the tent door, Sarah hears the news and she begins to laugh to herself. Because the very thing that seemed to be impossible to her was being said it was going to happen. As we talked about before, it's hard to blame Sarah for not believing it was possible. She has been barren her whole life, and she has undoubtedly given up on her chances of being included in God's promise. And on top of that, it tells us that the way of women has ceased with her, which is just a fancy way of saying that she's no longer having a period. She's post-menopausal at this point. She's 90 years old, after all. So we can't blame Sarah for laughing. It makes sense. Though you may wonder after hearing that, is this the first time that Sarah is hearing this promise? Did Abraham tell her about what God had told him in chapter 17? Specifically that she's going to have a son. Well, given the nature of men, I wouldn't be surprised if he didn't, right? Abraham has this amazing experience with God, and he comes home to Sarah, and they're having dinner, and she asks him, well, honey, how was your day? And he just kind of shrugs. He goes, yeah, it was good, you know. And he forgets to mention the important details. You know, maybe he forgot to mention it to her, or perhaps he didn't say anything because he didn't believe in himself, right? If you remember, his reaction to the same promise was to laugh. He laughed as well. But my guess is that even if Abraham told Sarah about this, she probably still wouldn't have believed it, right? She would have still had her doubts. She would have maybe thought Abraham was crazy. But now, she hears God proclaim it with her own ears. And her response is to laugh. What she doesn't realize is that even though she probably just chuckled quietly to herself, God knew what her response was. And so God addresses her forthright with the question that Sarah was asking in her heart. Could God really do the impossible? Could God really do the impossible? Or as God puts it, is anything too hard, or otherwise translated as too wonderful for God to do? It is truly a powerful question. Here's why. What God is doing in this moment is He's shifting Abraham and Sarah's perspective. At that moment, they were looking at the hopelessness of their situation. They were obsessing over their lack of resources and the capabilities they have in and of themselves. She's barren. They're both old. Abraham has a son from a different woman. Sarah is postmenopausal, right? The list goes on and on. In their eyes, having a child in this situation is impossible. But what is the answer to God's question? Is God able to do the impossible? Yes, that is the answer. This pre-incarnate Jesus is shifting their focus from looking at the hopelessness of their situation to looking upon the unlimited resources and power that's available to them through God. This is very similar to what happens with the incarnate Jesus thousands of years later in Luke chapter 1. The angel Gabriel appears to Mary, this virgin who's going to become the mother of Jesus. And he tells her, the Holy Spirit will come upon you, and the power of the Most High will overshadow you. Therefore, the child to be born will be called Holy, the Son of God. And behold, your relative Elizabeth, in her old age, has also conceived a son. And this is the 6th month with her who is called barren. For nothing is impossible with God. Nothing will be impossible with God. Common sense tells you that a virgin cannot have a child. But nothing is impossible with God. And you know, your relative Elizabeth, he says to Mary, the one who has been barren her whole life, is now beyond normal childbearing years. She's pregnant. She's 6 months pregnant. Because nothing is impossible with God. And so can God really do the impossible? Absolutely. He will do it here in Genesis, and He will do it again and again, even up to this day. And you know, I don't know where you're at today, but I think if you are here, and if you want to have some sort of takeaway from this message, and this interaction between Sarah and Abraham and God, it's a reminder to us that our God is a God of the impossible. Our God is beyond any limits and constrictions that our natural world may have. And so that is why prayer and reliance on Him is so important. That is why we are called to cast our burdens on Him, because He cares for us. Because nothing is impossible with Him. So if you're in a situation right now where it just seems impossible and unpredictable and scary, know that it doesn't scare God. He's able to see above it. He's able to work through it, even if it seems impossible. And this doesn't mean that if you're in a hard financial situation, money is just going to fly out of the sky, or if you've made a mistake and that there's some consequences from that, doesn't mean that those consequences are going to go away. But it does mean that God is able to work in ways that you would probably least expect. So the call is for you and for us to trust in Him and allow Him to walk with you through the difficulties you face. Do you believe in miracles, church family? Yes. Can God do the impossible? Yes. Yes, He could, He can, and He will. So that's the first question. Could God do the impossible? Can God do the impossible? But now in our passage, we're going to see a significant shift. We see that even though these three men intended to give this good news to Abraham and Sarah, there is another mission that they intend to complete. And that leads us to the second question that God is going to ask. Let's look at it again. Verse 16. Then the men set out from there, and they looked down towards Sodom. And Abraham went with them to set them on their way. The Lord said, "Shall I hide from Abraham what I am about to do, seeing that Abraham shall surely become a great and mighty nation, and all the nations of the earth shall be blessed in him? For I have chosen him, that he may command his children and his household after him, to keep the way of the Lord by doing righteousness and justice, so that the Lord may bring to Abraham what he has promised him." And the Lord said, "Because of the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is great, and their sin is very great, I will go down to see whether they have done altogether according to the outcry that has come to me. And if not, I will know." So the next question, really it's a question that God asks himself, is should God reveal the confidential? In verse 17 he asks, "Shall I hide from Abraham what I'm about to do?" Right? He's asking this question to himself. And the question is this: should Abraham know my plans? Should I reveal to him that which up to this point I have kept a secret? And really the essence of this question is, can I trust Abraham with this information? And as you can see, God kind of tells us his thought process in a way. That since Abraham is to be the father of his chosen people, and since he has established his covenant with him, can he trust Abraham? Yes. Yes, he can. Should God reveal the confidential? Yes, he will. And so he tells them that which is confidential. That he and his angels are on almost a secret mission to scout out the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. And the reason why is interesting to me. Because he says an outcry has risen against the city. Now, my question is, if there's an outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah, who is it that's crying out? Who's doing the crying out to God? How has it gained his attention? You know, maybe it's surrounding nations, right? Nations that are witnessing the detestable practices that's happening in Sodom and Gomorrah. Maybe it's Abraham who kind of knows the sketchy things that are happening there. You know, the commentators that I read tended to interpret it in more of a general sense, that there's such a loud commotion from all the partying or whatever else is going on in Sodom that it reaches God's ears. It's that image in a way. But one perspective that I find really convincing comes from Pastor Skip Heitzig, who maybe you've heard on the radio before. He thinks that it was probably Lot crying out. Again, Abraham's nephew, who actually lives in the city of Sodom. that in his personal prayer life, Lot is crying out to God concerning the wickedness that's surrounding him in the city. I find it very interesting, especially when you look at 2 Peter 2:7. It tells us that God rescued Lot, a righteous man who is distressed by the depraved conduct of the lawless. I think Lot could be a real possibility here. But regardless of who it is, this outcry has grabbed God's attention. And so he's going to see for himself what exactly is going on here. But my guess is you're probably wondering, why would an all-knowing and all-present God need to, A, be informed about what's going on in Sodom? Because you think he knows, right? And why would he need to physically go to the city to check out what's happening? Well, the reasoning actually has a lot to do with what we're going to talk about next. This next question, the final question that is asked. So let's look at it together, starting in verse 22. So the men turned from there and went toward Sodom, but Abraham still stood before the Lord. Then Abraham drew near and said, "Will you indeed sweep away the righteous with the wicked? Suppose there are 50 righteous in the city. Will you then sweep away the place and not spare it for the 50 righteous who are in it? Far be it from you to do such a thing, to put the righteous to death with the wicked, so that the righteous spares the wicked. Far be that from you. Shall not the judge of all the earth do what is just?" And the Lord said, "If I find in Sodom 50 righteous in that city, I will spare the whole place for their sake." And Abraham answered and said, "Behold, I have undertaken to speak out to the Lord, I who am but dust and ashes. Suppose 5 of the 50 righteous are lacking. Will you destroy the whole city for lack of 5? And he said, "I will not destroy it if I find 45 there." And again he spoke to him and said, "Suppose 40 are there." He answered, "For the sake of 40, I will not do it." Then he said, "Oh, let not the Lord be angry, and I will speak. Suppose 30 are found there." He answered, "I will not do it if I find 30 there." And he said, "Behold, I have undertaken to speak to the Lord. Suppose 20 are found there." He answered, "For the sake of 20, I will not destroy it." And then Abraham said, "Oh, let not the Lord be angry, and I will speak again, but this once. Suppose 10 are found there." God answered, "For the sake of 10, I will not destroy Sodom and Gomorrah." And the Lord went his way. When he had finished speaking to Abraham, Abraham returned to his place. So here's why God is going to Sodom. Since he's serving in the role of judge, he's going to do his due diligence to assemble evidence to come up with a verdict. Now, the timing of all this is really fascinating. Because the idea we are getting from this passage is that God has allowed Sodom and Gomorrah to live in sin up to this point. And now his patience is up. You know, back in chapter 15, when God reveals to Abraham in a dream the future of his descendants, that they will be slaves in Egypt and they will return to the land of Canaan, God provides a really interesting explanation for all of that in verse 16. It tells us the Israelites will come back to Canaan in the 4th generation because the sin of the Amorites has not reached its full measure. Now, what does that mean? I think it means that God has a limit to the amount of grace and mercy he will show a group of people. Which that, at first, kind of doesn't make sense to us, right? How does that work? Because God is righteous and just, he's incredibly forbearing with people, right? Even with sin that's done against him, he forbears, he is patient. But at a certain point, God needs to enact judgment on them, because not doing so would actually be unjust. I want you to think of it in this way. I don't know if you've ever been in a position where you were ever over employees, or all of us, I'm sure, have been employees at one point in our life. But let's say there's someone in your organization who's struggling with their job. Their performance is poor, they're lagging behind, or maybe they're even creating a certain toxic environment amongst the other staff members. Now, if you're this person's boss, what's the appropriate first step in this situation? Confront them, right? Talk to them. Say, hey, this is your work is lacking. We really need you to improve. You meet with them. You give them some objectives to pursue to see improvement in their performance. But after a designated amount of time that you give them, if after that amount of time they do not improve, what's probably the best option? Warning. Maybe let's say you give them a second warning, then what? Eventually you have to fire them. Why? He's affecting the whole organization. In fact, it's not fair to the other employees who are performing well, who are doing their job, if you continue tolerating the lack of production from a bad employee for too long. The quality of the work environment would significantly be down for everyone else. And so I think we would all agree that if you were to fire the guy right away, that probably wouldn't be too fair, right? And I think we'd all agree that if you allowed them to linger on too long, that also would be unjust. And so that's what God is pursuing here. He's pursuing a true sense of justice. And that brings up Abraham's question, though. If God's going to serve as judge, will he actually be just? In other words, his question in this situation is this: would God do the unthinkable? Abraham's main concern is brought up in verse 23. Will you indeed sweep away the righteous with the wicked? In Abraham's view, doing so would be unjust. Why would God assign the same fate to the righteous people as he would to wicked people? As you might have gathered, his main concern has to do with his nephew Lot, who's living in the city of Sodom. And he's worried that God's going to kill him with the rest of the city. And that's why we see kind of Abraham cautiously kind of, try to get that number down of how many righteous will be there. 50, 45, 40, 30, how about 20, 10, right? And of course, if he answered, God gives a definitive answer. If he questioned, God gives an answer. He says, I will not kill, I will not destroy Sodom if there's only 10 people left. And so the answer to Abraham's question is no. God will not do the unthinkable. God would not act unjustly against those who are righteous. But what exactly is going on here between God and Abraham? Because at first glance, you almost get the feeling that Abraham is pushing God into a corner, that he's bargaining with God to get his way. Perhaps in a way he's trying to change God's mind, almost manipulating him by convincing him that it would be unjust to kill the righteous with the wicked. But that's not what we see here. And the clue is in verse 33. It says, when he, being who? When he, being God, was finished speaking to Abraham, he went on his way. Not when Abraham was done, but when God was done. God is the one who's leading the conversation. And so what God is doing here is he's inviting Abraham to be a part of the process. And this is where we can conclude that what Abraham is doing here is interceding on the behalf of the righteous living in Sodom. And intercession is kind of just a fancy way of saying that he's praying for them. He's begging God on their behalf. That intercession is something that all of us are called to do as Christians. But we're called to pray on the behalf of other people. That's why we pray here at church. That's why we gather on Tuesday nights to pray. But it's also why we're called to pray for others in our personal prayer life as well. But here's the million-dollar question in all of this. Does prayer change God's mind? What is happening when you pray? Is Abraham convincing God to change his mind here? No, that's not what's happening. And I think we can say that prayer does not change God's mind. So then what's the point of prayer?
God's in control.
God's in control. Perhaps it would be helpful if I asked this question instead. Does prayer change things? Does prayer change things? God's mind does not change because God is unchangeable. And there are certain things that he has set in stone that will come to pass no matter what. So no matter how hard you pray for Jesus not to return, he's still going to return, right? There's nothing you can do about that. You can't pray hard enough to stop that from coming. But I think from what we see in Scripture, prayer does change things. But it changes them according to God's will. Things change, but that doesn't mean it's outside the will of God. Prayer is simply God inviting us to be involved in the process, like he does with Abraham. So that we can participate with him in changing the way things are for his glory. The key in all of this is reorienting our prayers so that they are in line with God's will, as we are told in 1 John. And this is the confidence that we have toward him. That if we ask anything according to his will, he hears us. And if we know that he hears us whenever we ask, we know that we have a request that we have asked of him. God hears our prayers. And our prayers that are in line with his will legitimately change things. Now, I know I'm just scratching the surface. Right? There's a lot more to deal with this issue. So, this is kind of an invitation. Join us after the service for our Grow group. We're going to talk a little bit more about this issue. We're going to dive a little further into this situation. But the main point we need to take home from today is this, that our God is a great God. Our God is a God of mercy. He's a God of love. He's a God of the impossible. He includes us in the process of molding and shaping our world according to his will. And our God is a God of justice. Amen?